Grab a cup of coffee and start your day with Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life features stories to inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Visit cyacyl.com.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for joining us today. Have you tried to make changes in your life only to end up doing the same old thing over and over again? Do you look at successful people and wonder what they know that you don't? According to today's guest, Charles Duhigg, the key to making change and achieving what we want is to understand how habits work. He's here to discuss scientific discoveries that explain why habits exist and how they can be changed. Charles is the author of the book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. He's an investigative reporter for the New York Times and was part of the team of finalists for the 2009 Pultizer Prize. He's a contributor to This American Life, NPR, PBS NewsHour, and Frontline. Welcome, Charles. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Charles, your book, the information in it I found to be extremely fascinating. Eugene's story was amazing, and to just see the power of the mind and what it's capable of, I just thought that was so fascinating.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the story that you mentioned about Eugene Pauly is a really interesting one. Mr. Pauly was a man who, about midway through life, contracted viral encephalitis, which is the same disease that causes cold sores, but in very rare cases, when it enters your spine, it can get up into your brain and cause massive brain damage. It essentially eats away at portions of the brain. And in his case, it ate away at a part of his brain that affected his short-term memory. He was a complete amnesiac. He couldn't remember anything for more than, say, about 15 or 16 seconds. And yet what was really interesting is that even though Mr. Pauly could not remember anything. He couldn't remember who his grandchildren were. If you asked him where the kitchen was in his house, he couldn't tell you which door to go through to get there. Even though he had this disability, he was able to develop new habits. So, for instance, if he was hungry, he could stand up and walk to the kitchen and get down some nuts and feed himself. But he was not able to remember that. And that gave us this huge insight into how habits work not only within our neurology, but within our lives.
So, Charles, what is a habit? How is it formed? And is our life just a mass of habits?
So there was a woman named Dr. Wendy Wood who at Duke University did an experiment where she followed thousands of people around to try and figure out how much of our daily activities are, in fact, habits. And what she found was that about 40 to 45% of the decisions that we make every day aren't really decisions, they're habits. And in the last decade, what we've learned is how a habit works, particularly its neurological structure. There's three components to a habit. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to start, and then a routine, which is the behavior itself, and then finally a reward. And the reward is how our brain, in particular a part of our brain known as the basal ganglia, learns to remember that pattern for the future. And this is a pretty interesting insight because for years when people thought about changing habits, they always focused on the behavior, on the routine. But what we've learned is that it's really the cue and the reward that shape how habits unfold. If you want to change a habit or create a new habit, you have to focus on these triggers and these rewards, and the automatic behavior kind of follows on its heels.
So you have to do something different.
Exactly.
Now, Charles, what happens in the brain when a habit is formed?
There's essentially a neural connection that is formed between this cue and this reward with an accompanying behavior. The way that our neurology works is that when particular cues and rewards and behaviors are linked, a neural synapse, essentially a pathway in our brain, will begin to form associating those particular behaviors. And as the reward reinforces that behavior, it releases neurotransmitters that cause essentially the walls of that pathway to get thicker and thicker and thicker. As a result, it's easier for an electrical charge to move down that particular pathway. That's why something starts to feel sort of automatic at some point, is because it's become much easier for the impulse associated with that behavior to occur. Unfortunately, we don't know a huge amount about how this works. Our understanding of neurology is still relatively limited. But we do know that these cues and these rewards, that's why they're important, is because they seem to shape how these neural pathways associated with particular behaviors develop.
And the reason I asked that question, Charles, because this is something that we can actually see on a scan.
what we can see is we can see different changes in blood flow through the brain. So when we're using what are known as fMRIs or functional MRIs, what we can see is changes in how essentially areas of the brain receive more or less blood as a behavior changes. And as people change their sort of habits, their daily lives, we know that there's a change in cognition because we see different areas of the brain become active over time.
Charles, you've been talking about the cue and reward, and is this when someone wants to lose weight or quit smoking, and they have that habit? Say, for example, you sit down at night on the couch and you watch TV, and immediately you want to grab the potato chips because it's a habit. Or maybe you can go all day without smoking when you're at work, but the minute you get in the car, you roll down the window and light up a cigarette. Is that what you're talking about, and are those the types of things that we need to change the cue in order to change that habit?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think that a lot of people, particularly when it comes to food habits, have these location-based cues. But the key is not to change the cue. It's more to recognize the cue and change the behavior. So within neurology, there's this theory called the golden rule of habit change, which says that if you want to change an automatic behavior, what you need to do is you need to recognize the cue, the trigger that causes it, and recognize the reward. And instead of trying to change the cue and reward, which is very, very challenging, that you should instead try and find a new behavior that seems triggered by that old cue and to deliver a reward that's similar to that old reward. So cigarettes is a great example. One of the most effective smoking cessation therapies available is to figure out when people smoke. So, for instance, most people will smoke with their morning coffee, or they'll smoke in the car, as you pointed out. And then try and come up with something that replicates the reward that they're getting from that activity. For most people, nicotine provides this burst of energy. It's kind of an energizer that people come to rely on. And so giving them something that reproduces that same reward, say a double espresso or a nicotine replacement that has some type of caffeinating or energizing effect, will in fact help that person stop smoking.
In your book, you shared a story about a woman who wanted to take a trip. She had just gotten divorced and she wanted to take a trip, and she believed that she needed to quit smoking in order to make this trip possible. And that one change, quitting smoking, set off a chain of reactions of different changes. How does that happen? I mean, is that something that we can emulate in our lives?
Well, yeah, we see this happen quite a bit. So one of the things that researchers have discovered is that some habits seem to be more important than others. They seem to have this greater impact on our lives. They refer to those as keystone habits because once they start to shift, they seem for some reason to set off a chain reaction that changes other patterns, other habits, more effortlessly. And so for the woman that you mentioned, Lisa Allen, she had just her husband had just told her he wanted to leave her. She was overweight. She was a chronic smoker. She had trouble holding down jobs, and so she decided to go to Egypt. And while she was in Egypt, and all of her cues were kind of, up for grabs, she went out to the pyramids. And when she was on her way to the pyramids, she saw the desert that surrounds them on three sides. And she decided that she was going to come back within the year and cross the desert. And that in order to do that, in order to survive that experience, she needed to give up smoking. Now, this actually doesn't make any sense because the only way to cross the Egyptian desert is in a car. And you have to put in, water and food and a whole bunch of other stuff. You can easily put in cartons of smokes as well. But she became convinced that giving up smoking was the key to achieving this goal. And so she started focusing on giving up smoking. And once she quit smoking, it did seem to start this chain reaction. For Lisa Allen, the woman in the story, smoking was a keystone habit that once it began to shift, it shifted a number of other things. She started eating more healthily and started exercising more. She ended up running a marathon 2 years later. Her relationships and sort of the habits she brought to relationships got much better, much more positive. And when people look at her life and lives like hers, what they recognize is that for some reason, one habit becomes very, very key to our sense of self-image, right? For Lisa, it was smoking. Giving up smoking for her seemed to represent more than just giving up smoking. And once she was able to give up smoking, all these other changes in her life sort of fell into place. Studies show that this actually happens all the time. For a lot of people, exercise is a keystone habit. And studies indicate that for many people, when they start exercising, they start eating more healthfully without really thinking about it, which makes sense, right? you feel good about your body, and so your eating habits change. What's interesting, though, is that also on average, people who start an exercise habit, they start using their credit cards less. They very often start doing chores, like doing their dishes, earlier in the day by about 23 minutes. And the importance there is that obviously no one starts exercising and thinks about exercising when they're in the checkout line and pulling out their credit card. And yet, for some reason, for many people, starting to exercise changes their self-image enough that they're able to, that it sort of filters down to their other automatic behaviors.
Charles, with this type of power within our reach, why do you think we fall short when we try to make change? What are we missing?
Well, usually when people are trying to make changes, they're not paying attention to the cues and rewards, right? They're really not diagnosing the behavior. So it's very common, for instance, that someone says, I want to lose weight. I'm going to start eating more healthfully. That's almost guaranteed to fail if that's your whole plan, is I'm going to start eating more healthfully. What you really need to do, according to studies, is you need to recognize, okay, when during the day do I end up eating unhealthy foods? Let's say it happens that your intentions are good in the morning, and then when you get into the cafeteria, you end up having a slice of pizza, and then when you're feeling sluggish in the afternoon, you go get a candy bar. Okay, so now you know your cues. Your cues are lunchtime and this sense of sluggishness in the afternoon. And then you figure out what the rewards are. Why are you eating that pizza? Perhaps it's because you've had a long day and you feel, that you need something to kind of reward yourself. You want to feel good, in which case you need to ask, okay, what else can make me feel good? Perhaps it's a matter of, taking 20 minutes and just sort of surfing the web or calling a friend. Maybe it's eating something that has a taste novelty, but it doesn't have to be pizza or a candy bar. It can be an apple or some fruit. Once you identify the cues and rewards, then you need to come up with a plan to say, okay, look, instead of saying, I'm going to eat more healthily today, to say, at lunchtime, I'm going to walk in and I'm going to get a salad and I'm going to put on top of it strawberries because I know that strawberries are particularly sweet and I really like them. And then in the afternoon when I'm feeling sluggish, at 3:30, I'm going to set the alarm on my watch and then I'm going to get up and I'm going to take a walk around the block for 20 minutes and sort of let myself feel really re-energized. That's what's important, is to have these specific plans. Within psychology, these are known as implementation intentions. And they're shown to be much more effective at creating change. When people fail to change, it's usually because they don't have a specific plan and they haven't diagnosed how their behavior is actually going to work. But once you begin to diagnose that, according to studies, your odds of succeeding are much, much higher.
And as I said, we have this power within our reach. Charles, this is a good point for us to take a break for this week's Good Life Tips. Stay with us for information to help you make the positive life changes that we talk about on the show. When we return, I'll continue the discussion with Charles Duhigg. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Our guest today is Charles Duhigg, author of the book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. Charles, before break, we were talking about how habits influence us on a personal level. I'd like to focus now on how we can take this information and incorporate it into our professional lives. Understanding the cues and the routine and reward, how can we take that loop and apply it to achieving professional success?
Well, one of the things that we know is that organizations develop habits the same way that individuals do, right? I'm sure that for everyone who's listening, that in their workplace there's organizational habits, sort of institutional habits that they hardly even think about. How you do expenses, how people communicate with each other, how bosses and subordinates share information. All of those behaviors, according to researchers who have looked into this, follow these same the same basic principle of how habits unfold, right? There's usually some type of trigger or cue for an institutional habit and a reward that's being given to people as a result. And so beginning to diagnose those helps people understand how to succeed. There's been a number of studies that have looked at for instance, take the fashion industry. The fashion industry is one of these really interesting industries where almost everyone who's in it is creative, or at least who runs a fashion label. It's very hard to become a fashion designer without being creative in the first place. But there's this fundamental question, why do some fashion houses succeed and others fail? And what studies indicate is that the houses that succeed are the ones that get institutional or organizational habits right. That essentially, if you don't have a habit in place and automatic routines for dealing with things like sourcing materials or pricing garments or communicating across distributed workforces, people who might be all over the world, If you don't habitualize that, you spend so much time thinking about it and just dealing with logistics that you don't actually have time to be creative. The main differentiator between successful and unsuccessful fashion houses is not creative metrics. It's whether the company itself or the fashion designer can habitualize these business practices. And so that's really important for people's own workplace and their own professions and careers, is to ask yourself, which part of your day can you make into a habit? Which part of your day can you stop thinking about so that it happens automatically and gives you more time to think about the things that are important, be that creativity or being able to have enough time to focus on a project, etc.
And that would lead to improved efficiency.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a huge part of efficiency that seems to be driven by your ability to routinize certain behaviors so you don't have to think about them.
Charles, what about what the corporations know? How are they manipulating us with this information?
Well, one of the things that we spent a lot of time writing about, and in fact, the New York Times Magazine printed an excerpt of my book, The Power of Habit, about how Target was looking at shoppers' habits in order to understand their lives. Target, the store, is so good at this that, in fact, they could look at some shoppers' habits and predict whether they were pregnant or not based on how what they were buying changed. Oftentimes, women who are pregnant, at about the end of their first trimester, they'll stop buying scented lotion and start buying unscented lotion. Very often, a few weeks later or earlier, they'll start buying particular vitamins. And this is really important because companies use this information to figure out how to market to us, right? What's interesting is that someone who might not have told Target they were pregnant, who might not have told some of their family members that they're pregnant, will suddenly start getting all these coupons in the mail from Target for baby diapers or cribs or wipes. For some people, this is kind of scary. They don't like the idea of stores spying into their lives. But the important takeaway, I think, from this is that to be aware of this. Companies only have the power to sort of spy on us if we allow them to, if we're not aware of what's going on. And so the more aware you are of the coupons you get via email or via the postal mail, the more you can be aware of what the companies are seeing within our lives and what assumptions they're making about who we are.
How do leaders and athletes use the information that we've been talking about today for their success?
Well, I think those are two different categories. Athletes in particular think a lot about habitualizing their practice routines because so much of what they do is dependent upon being comfortable in any situation, particularly a competitive situation. So in the book, we spend a lot of time talking about the story of Michael Phelps, the Olympian who's won more gold medals than anyone else. He's a swimmer, as I'm sure all of your listeners know. When Michael Phelps started swimming when he was 7 years old. And what was interesting is that from the start, he had a physical build that made him a very good swimmer. And particularly, he has a long torso and relatively shorter legs that provide less drag in the water. But his coach felt that it was really important for Michael to not only be the most physically fit swimmer in the pool, but the most mentally fit swimmer in the pool. Because on race day, he would oftentimes kind of fall apart. He would let the stress get to him and he would choke. So one of the things that his coach, Bob Bowman, did is he developed a number of habits, routines for Phelps to follow every day. Michael Phelps always on a race day eats the same thing every morning. He wakes up at the same time. He goes through the same stretching routine in the exact same order. Everything is set to be exactly the same. And the reason why is that they wanted to make it feel like this is a day like any other day he's ever had. In addition, every night before Michael Phelps goes to sleep and every morning when he wakes up, he spends about 10 minutes visualizing the perfect race. And he tries to visualize the perfect race down to the smallest details. What it'll feel like to jump into the water. What it'll feel like when your arms swing over your head. When you get to the final lap, what you're going to be thinking about. When you get to the end of it, how you're going to take your goggle and your swim cap off. The reason why they work so hard to try and get every single detail kind of right and visualize it is that by the time Michael Phelps is actually competing in a real race, it'll almost feel anticlimactic. And in fact, after Michael Phelps set one of his world records at the China Olympics, the reporters asked him, how did that feel? What were you thinking about? And he said, it felt just like every other practice, right? This is someone who's so accustomed to this basic activity that even when he's in the water setting a world record, it feels very natural and relaxed because it's all become habit.
The book is The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business by Charles Duhigg. Charles, if our listeners would like to get more information about you and your work, where can they go?
I'd love to hear from them. The book, The Power of Habit, it's being sold on Amazon and BarnesandNobles.com. They can come to my website if they'd like, which is thepowerofhabit.com, and all of my contact information is there.
And as always, our listeners can visit our website, cyacyl.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on our site, listen to past shows as podcasts, read the digital magazine, sign up for our mailing list, take part in the book club, and be sure to follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Charles, thank you for spending time with us today. As I said in the beginning, I found the information extremely fascinating, and the interesting thing for me is that when you talk about the routine, I always thought that that would lead to boredom, but I can actually see how by incorporating new habits, I can streamline my life and become more efficient, and I'm really happy that you were here to share this information, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
This is Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.